Bernie Sanders, FDR, and socialism in America. What do they have in common?
We'll get to that, but first, some context. Socialism can trace its roots back to the French Revolution, but when we think of socialism, we typically think of Karl Marx. Marx and Frederick Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, in which they described a time when the proletariat, or the working class, would overthrow the capitalist system, ushering in an era of socialism.
According to Marx, this new socialist government would act as an intermediary between capitalism and communism. During this time, class distinction would fade away, and everyone would start to get along super great or something. In his Communist Manifesto, Marx describes the return of political power to the people through socialism.
Once classes faded away, political power and political parties would become obsolete, ending class struggle. Yet, communism is not clearly defined in Marx's writings, other than to be understood as a state never to be fully achieved, but rather always striven toward.
Think of Marx's communism less as a form of government and more of a kind of utopian goal. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, not George Orwell's Animal Farm.
Marx's socialism as the transitional government between capitalism and communism has never existed anywhere on the planet.
But socialism has existed in real life in two forms. One is autocratic socialism. The most notable autocratic socialist state in history is the USSR.
You know, the commies. The guys who arrested religious leaders for posing a threat to Joseph Stalin and his soul worship. Those guys. They gave a really bad name to socialism many years ago.
The second form of socialism is democratic socialism. That's what we're more interested in. Take the UK's Labour Party, for example. Established circa 1870, the party was formed in response to the underrepresentation of the urban labour class in post-industrial revolution UK, and quickly became a prominent party there.
The UK's Labour Party is a democratic socialist party which aims to share political power amongst the many rather than the few.
The United Kingdom's Labour Party supports policies such as strengthening the national health services, raising the minimum wage to a living wage, extending paid parental leave, and free daycare.
These kinds of labour parties are common throughout the Western world, with comparable parties and models found in nations such as Australia, France, Israel, and the Scandinavian countries. And yet, America does not have a Labour Party worth mentioning. Why is that?
Well, that has to do with our deeply embedded two-party system. Given the US's winner-take-all voting system, which deems the candidate with the most votes the winner, without necessarily requiring majority of the votes, it was natural for two parties to emerge.
Any third party will always fail in this system, while simultaneously dragging down the party with which they most closely align by splitting the vote.
Let's look at the Democrats and the Republicans. The electorate is typically split between these two ideologically opposing parties.
But if you introduce a third party, such as another leftist party to rival the Democrats, then those who vote left would be split, handing the victory to the Republican Party.
The US used to have a party like the UK Labour Party called the American Labour Party. It was founded in 1934 by George Counts, get this, in an effort to support FDR, but it failed as all third parties in the US tend to do.
When living in a democratic republic, especially one with such a large and diverse population as is in the United States, having a two-party system almost seems to make sense. If your party is not in the White House this term, you can still vote it into Congress, or just wait 4 years and try again. Having more than two parties immediately takes away the your turn, my turn element so built into the structure.
So, over time the two parties have been solidified.
Now we know why America has two major parties, but why isn't one of them the Labour Party?
Basically, because the two established parties were around before the labor movement. The American Federal Labor Union was founded in 1886 by Samuel Gompers. The AFL and the end of the Industrial Revolution were both predated by the current two major American parties. Rather than starting a destined-to-fail third party, labor interests opted to acquire representation within the existing political structure.
Instead of having their own party in America today, labor is just one constituency of the Democratic Party, and a declining one at that. And yet, democratic socialism has existed in America in some sense. Take FDR, for example.
Under President Hoover, laissez-faire or too-let-do economics led to a boom followed by an economic bust that would spring up breadlines and homeless communities aptly named Hoovervilles all over the country. You've heard of it, the Great Depression.
Under these conditions, a previously economic conservative named Franklin Delano Roosevelt swept into the presidency, ushering in the New Deal. With socialist policies, many of which are still around today, FDR would arguably bring about the end of the Great Depression.
FDR's goals were to get Americans back to work, protect their savings and create prosperity, provide relief for the sick and the elderly, and get industry and agriculture back on their feet. How did he do these things?
demand-side economics, or the creation of spending power for the average American, as well as addressing risky banking and business practices. Piece of cake. FDR brought about programs which employed 8.5 million Americans to rebuild infrastructure and other public works projects, closed banks for a few days, evaluated them, and allowed economically sound ones to reopen, created an economic safety net for the sick and elderly still here today, and set laws regulating minimum wage, work week hour restrictions, and child labor.
Today, America has returned to a state of economic inequality that has not been seen since just before the Great Depression. Yet, during our slow crawl out of the current economic crisis, these demand-side economic strategies have been dramatically opposed.
History is repeating itself, but Americans are yet to see another New Deal.
However, some politicians, such as Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, do support another New Deal-style approach, which some see as overdue.
We can only compare Bernie's proposed policies in his presidential campaign to FDR's actual presidency and the UK's Labour Party, but we think that the connection is worth pointing out.
Bernie's policies include expanding Obamacare and establishing healthcare as a right to all Americans, raising the national minimum wage to a living wage of $15 an hour, establishing a 12-week paid parental leave and subsidized daycare, and taking on Wall Street, as well as reforming the tax code and U.S. banking practices. Bernie is continuing the work that FDR started, and both are ideologically aligned with time-tested democratic socialism.
Although, truth be told, Americans don't seem to care much about policy these days.
Please subscribe if you enjoyed.
And stay tuned for more.